Spring had arrived early in London that year, and by late April, the cherry trees on Gowan Avenue were already in full bloom. It was the kind of street where nothing bad ever happened. Neat Victorian houses, tidy gardens, the sort of neighborhood where people still said good morning to each other. Monday, April 26, 1999, started like any other day there. Quiet, peaceful, ordinary. Jill Dando wasn't supposed to be there that morning. She'd spent Sunday night at her fiancé's place across town in Chiswick, and she had a full day ahead. Meetings at the BBC, preparations for her shows, 1,000 small details to manage for the wedding she'd been planning for September. But she needed to grab a few things from her house in Fulham, the place she'd lived alone for years but would soon be leaving behind. Just a quick stop, in and out, then on with her day. That was the plan anyway. She pulled up in her blue BMW convertible around 11:30, parking right outside the gate. The sun was out, warm enough that she'd left her coat in the car. She grabbed her shopping bags, found her keys, and walked through the gate toward her front door. 7 tiled steps, a path she'd walked hundreds of times before. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing looked out of place. She had no reason to think this would be the last time she'd ever come home. But someone else was there. Someone who had been watching, waiting, counting down the moments until she arrived. As Jill bent down to unlock her door, concentrating on fitting the key into the lock, they made their move. One shot. Direct contact to her left temple. The gun had been pressed so hard against her head that it actually left an imprint on her skin. She collapsed right there on her doorstep, keys clattering onto the tiles, shopping bags spilling around her. And just like that, the person who'd done this was gone, disappeared into the late morning streets of Fulham as if they'd never existed. Here's what makes it even more disturbing. For 15 minutes, Jill Dando lay there bleeding on her own front step while the world just kept going. Cars drove past. Birds sang in the cherry trees. Someone somewhere was making lunch. Life carried on like nothing had happened. It wasn't until her neighbor, Helen Dobley, came home and found her that anyone even knew. The paramedics came racing in with sirens blaring, finally breaking the quiet of that peaceful street. They tried everything they could, but there was no saving her. Just after 1 o'clock that afternoon, doctors at Charing Cross Hospital pronounced Jill Dando dead. The news hit Britain like a physical blow. This wasn't just any victim. This was Jill Dando, the face of Crime Watch. The woman millions of people invited into their living rooms every week. The one who helped catch criminals, who asked the public to come forward with information about unsolved crimes. Now she was lying in a morgue, and someone had gotten away with killing her in broad daylight on a Monday morning. The whole thing felt impossible. Who murders someone that famous, that visible, in the middle of the day on a residential street? And how do they just vanish afterward without leaving a single witness, a single clue, a single mistake? The Metropolitan Police threw everything they had at the case. Thousands of interviews, mountains of evidence, theories ranging from professional hitmen to obsessed stalkers. They even put someone in prison for it. But 8 years later, that conviction fell apart and the case went cold. Today, more than 2 decades later, nobody has been successfully prosecuted for killing Jill Dando. Somebody knows what happened on Gowan Avenue that morning. Somebody pulled that trigger and walked away. And they've kept that secret ever since. In each video, we dive deep into real-life crime stories, the mysteries and investigations that have shaped history and captivated the world. We focus on the details, the evidence, the timelines, the people. From cold cases that have baffled investigators to infamous crimes that shocked nations, we examine each case with the thoroughness it deserves. Crime scenes, forensic evidence, and the detective work that either solved these cases or left them open. If you're ready to uncover chilling cases and learn about the crimes that remain unchanged, subscribe to our channel. My name is Greg and welcome to Unchanged. To understand why Jill Dando's murder sent shockwaves through Britain, you have to understand who she was. This wasn't just a celebrity getting killed, this was someone the entire country felt like they knew. Someone they trusted. Someone who sat in their living rooms every week and made them feel safe. Jill had come a long way from her roots in Weston-super-Mare, a seaside town in Somerset where she'd grown up as the daughter of a local newspaper editor. She'd started her career in local radio, working her way up through regional television before landing at the BBC in 1988. By the late 90s, she'd become one of the most recognizable faces on British television. She hosted the 6 o'clock news. She fronted Holiday, the BBC's popular travel program, whisking viewers off to exotic destinations with her warm, engaging style. She covered royal events with grace and professionalism. But it was Crime Watch that made her a household name. Every month, millions of people tuned in to watch Jill and her co-host Nick Ross present the nation's most serious unsolved crimes. She'd stand there in the studio looking directly into the camera, appealing to the public for help. Murders, armed robberies, sexual assaults, the worst of what humans do to each other. She'd walk viewers through the evidence, show CCTV footage, conduct interviews with investigating officers, then ask people to come forward if they knew anything. And it worked. Crime Watch had been instrumental in solving hundreds of cases since it started in 1984. Jill wasn't just reading a teleprompter, she was actively helping catch criminals. There was something about her that made people feel comfortable. She had this way of being serious without being grim, authoritative without being cold. She looked like someone you could trust, someone who genuinely cared about getting justice for victims. Middle-aged women saw her as a daughter. Young women saw her as a role model. Men found her attractive but approachable. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be on screen: professional, kind, down-to-earth. Her personal life was finally falling into place too. After a long relationship that hadn't worked out, she'd met Alan Fentiman, a gynecologist, and they'd gotten engaged the previous year. The wedding was set for September 1999. She'd been house hunting with him, planning their future together, talking about maybe starting a family. Friends said she seemed genuinely happy, more settled than she'd been in years. At 37, she had everything: a glittering career, a man she loved, financial security, public admiration. She was living the kind of life most people only dream about. That's what made what happened so incomprehensible. This wasn't some tragic accident or a long illness that gave people time to prepare. One moment Jill Dando was at the absolute peak of her life, planning a wedding and thinking about her next holiday special. The next moment she was dead on her doorstep with a bullet in her head. The randomness of it, the violence of it, the sheer audacity of someone executing Britain's most famous crime presenter in broad daylight, it didn't make sense. It still doesn't. And here's the thing that really got under people's skin. For years, Jill had been the voice telling families that justice would come, that the police wouldn't give up, that someone out there knew something and eventually the truth would emerge. She'd stood beside countless grieving relatives and promised them that their loved one's case mattered. Now she was the victim, her own face plastered across the news, and despite the biggest investigation the Metropolitan Police had ever mounted, despite thousands of hours of detective work and millions of pounds spent, no one could give her family the justice she'd helped deliver to so many others. Sunday night had been quiet and ordinary. Jill stayed over at Alan's house in Chiswick, something she'd been doing more and more often lately. They'd been together for about 2 years now, engaged for one, and the wedding plans were coming together nicely. September couldn't come fast enough as far as she was concerned. They'd spent the evening like any normal couple. Dinner, television, conversation about the week ahead. Alan had an early surgery scheduled for Monday morning at the hospital where he worked as a consultant gynecologist. Jill had meetings at the BBC. They were both busy people with demanding careers, but they made it work. When Monday morning arrived, Alan left first. Jill took her time getting ready, no rush, enjoying the lazy start to her day. She planned to head straight to the BBC offices from Chiswick, but sometime that morning she realized she needed a few things from her house in Fulham. Nothing urgent, nothing that couldn't have waited, but she was in the area and it made sense to stop by. Maybe she wanted to check her mail, pick up some clothes, grab documents she needed for work. The exact reason doesn't really matter now. What matters is that she decided to make that detour. She left Alan's house mid-morning, climbing into her blue BMW 3 Series convertible, a car she loved, sporty and fun, perfect for London traffic. The drive from Chiswick to Fulham isn't far, maybe 15 minutes on a good day. She would have taken the familiar route along the Thames, windows probably down because the weather was so nice, radio playing, just another Monday commute. She had no reason to think this drive was any different from the hundreds of others she'd made over the years. Gowan Avenue, where Jill owned her house, sits in a part of Fulham that estate agents love to describe as highly desirable. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained Victorian and Edwardian houses, the kind of neighborhood where property values only ever seem to go up. It's quiet there, residential, the sort of place where everyone knows the sound of their neighbor's car pulling up. Jill had lived at number 29 since 1995, a ground-floor maisonette that she'd made into a comfortable home. She loved that house, even though she'd soon be leaving it behind for the place she and Alan were buying together. She arrived at approximately 11:30 a.m. Several neighbors would later tell police they remembered seeing her blue BMW pull up outside, heard the engine cut off, watched her get out of the car. Nothing seemed unusual. No suspicious vehicles lurking nearby, no strangers hanging around, nothing that made anyone's mental alarm bells ring. This was Gowan Avenue on a Monday morning, safe, familiar, boring in the best possible way. Jill locked the car and walked through the small gate that led to her front door. She was carrying shopping bags. She'd stopped somewhere that morning, picked up a few things. She was dressed casually, no need for the polished television presenter look when she was just running errands. Her keys were in her hand as she approached the 7-tiled steps leading up to her blue front door. Above her, cherry blossoms from the tree in her small front garden drifted down, catching in the spring breeze. This is where the timeline gets fuzzy in a way that would drive investigators crazy for years afterward. The attack happened somewhere between 11:30 and 11:40 a.m., but nobody saw it happen. Not directly. Not clearly enough to give police anything useful. In a neighborhood where people were home, where windows overlooked the street, where Mrs. So-and-so could usually tell you exactly who came and went at what time, the murder of Jill Dando occurred in a bizarre pocket of invisibility. What police would eventually piece together from various witness statements painted an incomplete picture. A few neighbors heard what might have been a scream, but it was brief, cut short. Someone else thought they heard a car door slam or maybe a gate banging shut. One witness reported seeing a man walking away from the area around that time, well-dressed, dark-haired, calm, purposeful. But the description was vague, the timing uncertain. Nobody could say for sure that they'd seen the actual shooting. Here's what definitely happened. As Jill crouched down slightly to fit her key into the lock, someone approached from behind. They moved quickly, decisively, with the kind of confidence that suggests this wasn't their first time holding a gun. They got close, very close, pressing the weapon directly against the left side of her head, just above her ear. Then they pulled the trigger. The weapon was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, though police would never recover it. The single shot fired was a round designed to kill, a hollow point or similarly devastating ammunition that would cause maximum damage. The contact wound meant that hot gases from the discharge entered the wound along with the bullet, and the muzzle was pressed so hard against her skull that it left a distinctive circular imprint on her skin. This wasn't someone firing wildly from a distance. This was execution style, professional, deliberate. Jill collapsed immediately, falling forward onto her doorstep. The shopping bags tumbled from her arms, their contents spilling across the tiles. Her keys fell from her hand with a sharp metallic sound that nobody heard, or at least nobody registered. She landed in what would be described as a crouched position, face down, one arm extended as if she tried to break her fall. Blood began pooling around her head, seeping into the grooves between the tiles. And then, nothing. The shooter was gone. Just gone. Vanished into the late morning streets of residential London like smoke dissipating in wind. They'd fired one shot, killed one of Britain's most famous women, and disappeared without leaving a single solid clue behind. No witnesses who could provide a clear description. No fingerprints. No DNA. No weapon. No getaway car that anyone noticed. It was the kind of clean escape that usually only happens in movies. For approximately 15 minutes, Jill Dando lay dying on her doorstep while life on Gowan Avenue continued around her. A car drove past, the driver not noticing anything amiss. Someone's dog barked in a nearby garden. A delivery van made its rounds 3 streets over. The sun kept shining, the cherry blossoms kept falling, and somewhere in the distance, you could hear the constant hum of London traffic. 15 minutes doesn't sound like a long time until you think about someone bleeding out alone while the world just carries on. Helen Dobley, a neighbor who lived nearby, returned home around 11:40 a.m. She was walking toward her own house when she noticed something odd at number 29. At first, she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. Someone was lying at Jill's front door, crumpled on the step in an unnatural position. Was it Jill? Had she fainted? Had a medical emergency? Helen moved closer, her mind racing through possibilities, none of them as terrible as the reality. Then she saw the blood. So much blood. Pooled around Jill's head, soaking into her clothes, splattered on the door. Helen started screaming for help, running toward other neighbors, her voice high and panicked. Call an ambulance. Call police. Someone's been hurt. I think it's Jill. The emergency call went through at 11:47 a.m. The operator listened to Helen's frantic, breathless report. Someone shot, bleeding, not moving, please send help immediately. The address was logged, units were dispatched. An ambulance. Police cars. The machinery of emergency response kicked into gear, racing toward Fulham with sirens wailing. Other neighbors had emerged by now, drawn by Helen's screams. They gathered at the gate, horrified, not quite able to believe what they were seeing. That was Jill Dando. The Jill Dando. From the television. Lying in a pool of her own blood on her doorstep. Some tried to help, checking for signs of life, putting pressure on the wound even though it was clearly catastrophic. Others just stood there in shock, hands over their mouths, unable to look away but wishing desperately they could unsee what they were witnessing. The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics jumping out before the vehicle had fully stopped. They assessed the scene immediately, single gunshot wound to the head, massive trauma, victim unresponsive. They began emergency treatment right there on the doorstep, working with practiced efficiency even as they must have known deep down that this wasn't survivable. But you don't give up. You never give up. They got her onto a stretcher, into the ambulance, and raced toward Charing Cross Hospital with lights flashing and sirens screaming through the London streets. Police arrived almost simultaneously, and within seconds they understood this wasn't a random mugging or a burglary gone wrong. This was murder, deliberate and calculated. They began securing the scene immediately, putting up tape, moving the gathering crowd back, protecting potential evidence. Every second mattered now. Every detail could be crucial. This wasn't just any homicide, this was going to be massive. At Charing Cross Hospital, trauma surgeons were already prepped and waiting when the ambulance pulled up. They'd been given a heads up about the incoming patient. Female, late 30s, gunshot wound to the head, critical condition. What they didn't know yet was who she was. The doctors worked frantically, doing everything medical science could offer, but the damage was too severe. The bullet had torn through brain tissue, caused catastrophic bleeding, destroyed structures that no surgeon could repair. At 1:03 p.m., after every possible intervention had been attempted, they had no choice but to pronounce Jill Dando dead. Someone on the medical staff recognized her. Word began to spread through the hospital in shocked whispers. "That's Jill Dando, the woman from Crime Watch. She's dead. Shot. Murdered. Oh my God." The police officers who'd accompanied the ambulance made urgent calls back to their station. "You need to get senior detectives here now. This is huge. This is going to be everywhere." They were right. By early afternoon, the news had broken. First on radio, then television, then plastered across every website and newspaper. BBC presenter Jill Dando shot dead. Jill Dando murdered outside her home. Crime Watch host killed in Fulham. The headlines came fast and breathless, each one more shocking than the last. The reaction across Britain was immediate and visceral. People stopped what they were doing to watch the news reports, unable to believe what they were hearing. Jill Dando? Dead? Murdered? How was that possible? She wasn't involved in anything dangerous, wasn't investigating cartels or corrupt politicians. She was just a television presenter, someone who read the news and hosted travel shows. Why would anyone want to kill her? At the BBC, staff were devastated. Jill's colleagues couldn't process it. They'd just seen her last week. She'd been planning the next series of Holiday. She'd been talking about wedding flowers and honeymoon destinations. Now she was gone, killed in the most violent way imaginable. Nick Ross, her Crime Watch co-host, would later say he felt physically sick when he heard the news. Other presenters broke down on air trying to report the story. This wasn't some distant tragedy they could maintain professional distance from. This was family. Alan Fentiman received the news from police who came to find him at the hospital where he worked. He'd said goodbye to Jill that morning, kissed her, made plans for dinner later that week. Now detectives were telling him she was dead, shot, murdered, on her own doorstep. The wedding they'd been planning would never happen. The life they'd been building together was over before it really began. In one morning, everything he'd looked forward to had been ripped away. Back in Fulham, Gowan Avenue had transformed into a crime scene. Police had cordoned off the entire area, keeping journalists and curious onlookers at a distance. Forensic teams were going over every inch of Jill's front garden, the doorstep where she'd fallen, the street where the killer had escaped. They were looking for shell casings, footprints, fibers, anything the shooter might have left behind. They photographed everything, measured everything, documented everything. The blue BMW sat at the curb, also part of the crime scene now, also potentially holding evidence. Detectives were already knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, trying to construct a timeline. Who saw what? When exactly? Can you describe them? What were they wearing? Which direction did they go? The responses were frustratingly vague. Maybe a man. Maybe well-dressed. Maybe walking quickly. Maybe. Nobody had a clear answer. Nobody had seen enough to identify a suspect. As the afternoon wore on and the news continued to spread, flowers began appearing at the gate of number 29. People who'd never met Jill but felt like they knew her started showing up to leave bouquets, cards, teddy bears. The tributes piled up quickly, roses, lilies, handwritten notes expressing shock and grief. You helped so many families find justice. Britain has lost a treasure. Rest in peace, Jill. Within days, the memorial would stretch along the entire front of the property, a riot of color and grief. That night, the murder of Jill Dando was the lead story on every news broadcast in Britain. Her smiling face filled television screens across the country while reporters stood outside her house describing what little was known. The police had no suspects. They had no clear motive. They had no weapon. What they had was one of the most high-profile unsolved murders in modern British history and a nation demanding answers. Somewhere in London, someone who knew exactly what had happened on Gowan Avenue that morning was watching those same news reports. Maybe they felt satisfied with a job well done. Maybe they felt the first stirrings of panic as they realized the scale of what they'd unleashed. Maybe they felt nothing at all. But they were out there, somewhere, living their life, keeping their secret. And they would keep it for a very long time. The Metropolitan Police knew immediately that this case was going to be different from anything they'd handled before. Within hours of Jill's death, they'd assembled what would become one of the largest murder investigation teams in British history. Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell was put in charge, a seasoned investigator who'd worked countless homicides across London. But even he could sense this was going to be unlike anything he'd dealt with before. The victim was famous. The method was professional. The circumstances were baffling. And the entire country was watching, waiting for answers. By Tuesday morning, less than 24 hours after the murder, the investigation had a name: Operation Oxborough. The incident room at Kensington Police Station quickly filled with detectives, civilian staff, computers, phones, and mountains of paperwork that would only grow larger as the weeks went on. They set up a dedicated hotline for tips. They prepared appeals for witnesses. They began the painstaking process of tracking down everyone who might know anything about Jill Dando's life, her routines, her relationships, her enemies, if she even had any. The first challenge was figuring out why someone would want Jill dead. Unlike some murder cases where motives are obvious, jealous partners, financial disputes, long-standing feuds, this one offered no clear starting point. Jill wasn't involved in anything obviously dangerous. She wasn't an investigative journalist who'd been digging into criminal enterprises. She wasn't a whistleblower or a political activist. She was a television presenter who read the news, hosted a travel show, and fronted a program that helped police solve crimes. Who murders someone like that? The forensic evidence from the scene was frustratingly minimal. The killer had left no fingerprints, no DNA, no shell casing. The single bullet that killed Jill had fragmented inside her skull, making it harder to definitively identify the exact type of weapon used, though ballistics experts believed it was likely a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. The contact wound suggested someone who knew how to use a gun, who understood that pressing the barrel against the target ensured the shot wouldn't miss. This wasn't some amateur waving a weapon around. This was controlled, efficient, professional. Detectives went door to door along Gowan Avenue and the surrounding streets, interviewing anyone who might have seen something. The responses were maddeningly vague. One neighbor thought they'd heard a scream around 11:30, but it was brief and they dismissed it. Another mentioned seeing a man walking away from the direction of Jill's house sometime that morning, smartly dressed, dark hair, moving purposefully but not running. But the description was so general it could have fit thousands of men in London. No distinctive features, no clear view of his face, nothing that would help narrow down a suspect. One witness statement did stand out though. A man named Richard Hughes had been driving along Gowan Avenue that morning and reported seeing someone outside Jill's house who looked out of place. He described seeing a man who appeared to be waiting, looking agitated, checking his watch. But again, the details were fuzzy. Was this before or after the shooting? Was this person connected at all, or just someone waiting for a bus or meeting a friend? The police followed up on every lead, but nothing concrete emerged. As investigators dug into Jill's life, they found someone almost impossibly clean. No secret affairs. No financial problems. No hidden addictions or scandals waiting to explode. Her friends and colleagues described her as professional, kind, hardworking. Alan Fentiman, understandably devastated, cooperated fully with police. They examined his background, his whereabouts that morning, his relationship with Jill. He was exactly where he said he was, at the hospital, performing surgery with multiple witnesses to confirm it. There was no insurance policy taken out on Jill, no financial motive, no signs of relationship trouble. He'd lost the woman he was about to marry, and detectives quickly ruled him out as a suspect. Her ex-boyfriend, Bob Wheaton, was also looked at closely. They'd dated for several years before Jill met Alan, and the breakup hadn't been easy. But Bob had moved on, had his own life, and his alibi checked out. Police found no evidence of stalking, threatening behavior, or lingering obsession. It was just a relationship that had run its course the way relationships sometimes do. With no obvious personal motive emerging, investigators started looking at other possibilities. And this is where things got complicated, because once you open the door to more elaborate theories, the case can spiral in dozens of different directions. The first major theory centered on Jill's work with Crime Watch. Maybe someone she'd helped put away had gotten out of prison and wanted revenge. Or maybe a criminal whose case had been featured on the show blamed Jill for their arrest, even if she'd just been the presenter reading from a script. Police began reviewing every case Crime Watch had covered during Jill's tenure, cross-referencing with prisoners who'd been released recently. It was a massive undertaking, hundreds of cases, thousands of criminals, endless rabbit holes to explore. They found a few individuals with grudges, a few who'd made vague threats, but nothing that led anywhere concrete. Then there was the professional hit theory, and this one captured the public imagination in a way that's never really faded. The execution-style killing, the precision, the clean escape, it all suggested someone with training, with experience. Not a random street criminal but a hired assassin. But if it was a professional hit, who'd ordered it and why? This is where the theories got really wild. One angle focused on Jill's coverage of the Kosovo War for the BBC. In April 1999, NATO was bombing Serbia as part of the intervention in Kosovo, and the BBC's coverage was extensive. Some people theorized that Serbian nationalists had targeted Jill as retaliation for British involvement in the conflict. There were reports, never confirmed, that a Serbian warlord named Arkan had put out a hit on a prominent British journalist. Arkan was known for brutality, for using assassination as a political tool. Could Jill have been the target? The problem with this theory was that Jill wasn't really covering the Kosovo War in any significant way. She was reading news bulletins, yes, but she wasn't a war correspondent or investigative reporter digging into Serbian war crimes. Targeting her specifically would have been odd when there were so many other British journalists more directly involved in Kosovo coverage. Still, police couldn't completely dismiss it. They reached out to intelligence services, looked into Serbian criminal networks operating in London, investigated whether there'd been any chatter about targeting British media figures. Nothing definitive emerged, but the theory persisted. Another professional hit angle involved organized crime more broadly. Had Jill somehow stumbled onto something dangerous? Had she been approached by someone with information about criminal activity and been killed to keep her quiet? Again, investigators found no evidence of this. Jill's phone records showed no mysterious calls. Her colleagues knew of no secretive meetings or suspicious contacts. If she'd been investigating something dangerous, she'd left no trace of it. The IRA connection was another theory that got serious consideration. In April 1999, the Northern Ireland peace process was still fragile. The Good Friday Agreement had been signed a year earlier, but dissident Republican groups opposed to the peace deal were still active and dangerous. Some of these groups had been known to carry out assassinations, and they had the capability to plan and execute professional hits. For over a year, the investigation had gone nowhere. Then, in May 2000, police arrested a man named Barry George, and suddenly the case everyone thought might never be solved had a suspect in custody. The media erupted with the news. Finally, after 13 months of dead ends and frustration, someone was being held accountable for killing Jill Dando. But as time would prove, this wasn't the breakthrough it initially appeared to be. It was actually the beginning of one of the most controversial prosecutions in modern British history. Barry George lived about half a mile from Jill's house on Gowan Avenue. He was 40 years old when Jill was murdered, unemployed, living alone in a small flat in Crookham Road. To say he was an odd character would be putting it mildly. He had a history of mental health problems, had been in and out of institutions, and had a documented obsession with celebrities and firearms. His real name was Barry Michael George, but he'd gone through various name changes over the years, sometimes calling himself Barry Bulsara, appropriating the real surname of Freddie Mercury from Queen. That detail alone tells you something about how he saw himself. Neighbors described him as strange, a loner who'd show up at local events uninvited, who tried to insert himself into community activities in awkward ways. He'd been thrown out of a local territorial army unit for inappropriate behavior. He'd been arrested before for attempted rape back in 1980, though he'd been acquitted of that charge. He had convictions for indecent assault and attempted rape from separate incidents in the 80s. In short, Barry George was exactly the type of person who attracts police attention during a major investigation. Someone with a criminal history, someone who lived nearby, someone whose behavior raised red flags. What made him a suspect in Jill Dando's murder specifically? Several things, though none of them particularly solid when you examine them closely. First, he lived in the area and had no real alibi for the morning of April 26, 1999. He claimed he'd been at home, but he lived alone, so nobody could confirm that. Second, he'd been known to hang around BBC Television Centre, the BBC's main production facility in West London. Staff there had noticed him loitering on multiple occasions, trying to get close to celebrities, acting in ways that made people uncomfortable. Third, and this is where police really started focusing on him, he had an interest in guns. When detectives searched Barry George's flat in May 2000, they found what they described as a shrine to firearms. Photographs of weapons, magazine cutouts, diagrams. He'd been known to visit gun clubs, though he'd been banned from actually handling weapons. He'd talk about guns constantly, claimed to have military experience he didn't actually have, presented himself as someone knowledgeable about firearms and combat. To investigators looking for someone who'd executed a professional-looking hit with a handgun, Barry George's obsession with weapons seemed significant. But here's the thing, being weird isn't the same as being a murderer. Having an unhealthy interest in guns doesn't mean you've actually got one, much less that you used it to kill someone. Police knew they needed more than just Barry George's odd behavior and proximity to the crime scene. They needed evidence. Real, physical, forensic evidence that would connect him to Jill Dando's murder. The search of his flat produced one piece of evidence that would become central to the entire case. A single particle of firearms discharge residue found in the pocket of a coat hanging in his wardrobe. It was microscopic, invisible to the naked eye, only detectable through sophisticated forensic testing. But it was there, and the prosecution would argue it was the smoking gun, literally, that proved Barry George had fired a weapon around the time of Jill's murder. Firearms discharge residue, or FDR, is produced when a gun is fired. The explosion that propels the bullet also creates tiny particles containing elements like lead, barium, and antimony. These particles get deposited on the shooter's hands, clothes, and anything nearby. Finding FDR on someone can indicate they've recently fired a gun or been in close proximity to one being discharged. It's the kind of forensic evidence that sounds conclusive, the kind that makes juries sit up and pay attention. But, and this is crucial, that single particle could have come from anywhere. FDR can contaminate evidence easily. It can transfer from one surface to another. It can persist in environments for long periods. The coat in Barry George's wardrobe had been hanging there for months before police searched his flat. If that particle proved he'd killed Jill Dando in April 1999, why was it still there a year later? Why hadn't it been washed away or transferred elsewhere? And more importantly, One single particle wasn't really enough to prove anything definitively. Forensic experts would later testify that you'd expect to find much more FDR on someone who'd actually fired a gun at close range. On their hands, their face, their clothes. Not just one microscopic particle in a coat pocket. Police also presented evidence about Barry George's movements on the morning of the murder. They found CCTV footage showing someone they claimed was Barry George near Gowan Avenue around the time Jill was killed. The figure in the footage was distant, grainy, not clearly identifiable. The prosecution argued it was him. The defense argued you couldn't tell who it was from such poor quality video. Welcome to the world of ambiguous evidence. There was also the matter of his behavior after the murder. Barry George had apparently mentioned Jill Dando's death to people in his neighborhood, seemed to know details about it, brought it up in conversations. The prosecution suggested this showed guilty knowledge, that he was reliving his crime, couldn't help talking about it. The defense pointed out that Jill's murder was the biggest news story in Britain at the time. Everyone was talking about it. Everyone had read the newspaper reports or seen the television coverage. Of course, Barry George knew details about it, the entire country did. The case against him was circumstantial at best. No witness had identified him as the man seen near Jill's house that morning. No murder weapon was ever found in his possession or linked to him in any way. No forensic evidence from the crime scene matched him. No fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers from his clothing. The single particle of FDR was the only physical evidence connecting him to the crime, and it was questionable at best. But Barry George fit a narrative that people wanted to believe. He was local. He was strange. He had a criminal history. He was obsessed with guns and celebrities. He lived alone and had no solid alibi. In other words, he looked like someone who could have killed Jill Dando, even if the evidence proving he actually did was thin. His trial began in April 2001, exactly 2 years after Jill's murder. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented Barry George as a loner with a grudge against society, someone obsessed with fame and violence, someone who'd fixated on Jill Dando and decided to kill her. The motive they suggested was vague. Maybe he was obsessed with her, maybe he wanted to become famous himself by killing someone famous, maybe he just wanted to know what it felt like to kill. It wasn't a strong motive, but they argued it didn't need to be. Some people kill for reasons normal people can't understand. They brought in forensic experts to testify about that particle of FDR. They showed the jury the photographs from his flat, the images of guns and weapons, painting a picture of someone immersed in a fantasy world of violence. They presented the CCTV footage, asked the jury to believe that distant, unclear figure was Barry George stalking his victim. They emphasized his lack of alibi, his proximity to the crime scene, his known presence around the BBC. The defense fought back hard. Barry George's lawyers argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial, that their client was being prosecuted because he was weird and convenient, not because he was actually guilty. They brought in their own forensic experts who testified that a single particle of FDR proved nothing, that it could have come from anywhere, that finding it a year after the alleged crime made it essentially meaningless. They challenged the identification from the CCTV footage, pointed out that no witness had actually placed Barry George at the scene, emphasized that no murder weapon had been found. They also presented evidence of Barry George's mental health issues, arguing that while he had problems, while he behaved inappropriately in the past, that didn't make him a murderer. Being strange, being obsessed with guns and fame, even having a criminal history, none of that proved he'd killed Jill Dando. But here's the problem Barry George faced. He wasn't a sympathetic defendant. He came across poorly in court, awkward and odd in ways that made people uncomfortable. He had a history that made jurors wary. And the prosecution kept hammering home that particle of firearms residue, presenting it as definitive proof even though experts disagreed about its significance. The jury deliberated for days. When they finally came back with a verdict on July 2, 2001, they found Barry George guilty of murder by a majority verdict of 10-1. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 20 years. The conviction made headlines across Britain. Finally, after more than 2 years, Jill Dando's killer had been caught and punished. Justice had been served. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not really. Because from the moment that guilty verdict was delivered, serious questions hung over the conviction. Legal experts looked at the evidence and scratched their heads. How had a jury convicted based on such thin proof? That single particle of FDR, the ambiguous CCTV footage, the lack of any witnesses or physical evidence from the crime scene, was that really enough to put someone away for life? Barry George's lawyers immediately began working on an appeal. They argued the conviction was unsafe, that the evidence didn't support a guilty verdict beyond reasonable doubt. In 2002, the Court of Appeal heard their arguments but upheld the conviction. The judges agreed the case was circumstantial but felt the jury had been entitled to reach the verdict they did. Barry George remained in prison. But the doubts wouldn't go away. Journalists started digging deeper into the case, questioning the forensic evidence, interviewing experts who expressed skepticism about that crucial particle of FDR. Some pointed out that the Metropolitan Police had been under enormous pressure to solve this case, that they needed to charge someone, that Barry George had been a convenient target. Others noted that the real killer, if it wasn't Barry George, had gotten away because police had stopped looking once they'd made an arrest. Over the next few years, as Barry George sat in prison maintaining his innocence, support for his case began to grow. The Criminal Cases Review Commission, an independent body that investigates potential miscarriages of justice, took another look at the evidence. In 2007, they referred the case back to the Court of Appeal, citing concerns about the reliability of that firearms discharge residue evidence. This time, when the Court of Appeal heard the case in November 2007, they came to a different conclusion. The judges ruled that the original trial had placed too much weight on forensic evidence that was actually highly questionable. That single particle of FDR, which the prosecution had presented as proof of guilt, was so ambiguous and unreliable that it shouldn't have been given such prominence. The conviction was quashed. After 8 years in prison for a murder he may not have committed, Barry George was granted a retrial. The second trial began in June 2008. This time, the prosecution couldn't rely as heavily on the FDR evidence. Its credibility had been too damaged by expert testimony. They tried to make the case based on the other circumstantial evidence, but without that supposedly definitive forensic proof, their case looked even weaker than before. The defense hammered away at the lack of solid evidence, the absence of any witnesses, the failure to find a murder weapon, the essentially speculative nature of the entire prosecution. The jury in the second trial deliberated for just over a day. On August 1, 2008, they returned a verdict of not guilty. Barry George walked out of court a free man after spending 8 years in prison for a crime the justice system could no longer say with confidence he'd committed. The acquittal was devastating for everyone involved. For Jill's family and friends, it meant the person they'd been told was her killer actually might not have been. It meant the real murderer could still be out there, unpunished, free. For the Metropolitan Police, it was an embarrassment. They'd put the wrong man away, or at least they'd failed to prove beyond reasonable doubt that they had the right one. For Barry George, 8 years of his life had been taken for a crime he may well not have committed, though his reputation was so damaged by the association that rebuilding any kind of normal life would be nearly impossible. And for everyone who'd followed this case, who'd invested emotional energy in seeing justice done for Jill Dando, it was a crushing disappointment. Because if Barry George didn't kill her, then who did? And would they ever be caught? The Barry George saga revealed something troubling about the investigation. Police had been so desperate to solve this high-profile case that they'd arrested someone who fit a profile rather than someone definitively connected by evidence. They'd built a circumstantial case around a troubled man who looked suspicious, who lived nearby, who had no alibi, who seemed like he could be guilty. And for 8 years that had been enough. Until it wasn't. Looking back now, it's hard not to see the Barry George prosecution as a massive misstep. A case where the desire for resolution overwhelmed the requirement for solid proof. The real killer of Jill Dando, whoever they are, benefited enormously from police focusing on the wrong person. While detectives built their case against Barry George, while prosecutors prepared for trial, while he sat in prison year after year, the actual murderer remained free, their secret intact. The case was officially reopened after Barry George's acquittal, but by then the trail was 9 years cold. Whatever slim chances police had of solving the murder in those crucial early days had long since evaporated. The investigation remained technically active, but nobody really expected a breakthrough. Too much time had passed. Too much evidence had been lost or compromised. Too many leads had gone nowhere. Barry George's story within the larger Jill Dando case serves as a cautionary tale about tunnel vision in investigations, about the dangers of circumstantial evidence, and about what happens when the pressure to solve a case overwhelms the need to solve it correctly. He may have been a troubled man with a disturbing history, but that didn't make him a murderer. And the 8 years he spent in prison for a crime he likely didn't commit represent their own kind of injustice, separate from but connected to the original injustice of Jill Dando's unsolved murder. When Barry George walked out of court a free man in August 2008, the investigation into Jill Dando's murder was essentially back at square one. 9 years had passed since that Monday morning in Fulham. 9 years of theories, leads, dead ends, and wasted time pursuing the wrong person. The Metropolitan Police announced they were reopening the case, that they'd continue searching for Jill's real killer, but nobody really believed much would come of it. The trail had gone cold years ago, and whatever slim chances they'd had of solving this case had evaporated while they'd focused on building a flawed prosecution against Barry George. Detective Chief Inspector Hamish Campbell, who'd led Operation Oxborough from the beginning, retired not long after the acquittal. In interviews, he maintained that the investigation had been thorough, that they'd followed the evidence where it led, that Barry George had been a legitimate suspect based on what they knew at the time. But you could hear the frustration in his voice, the disappointment that this case, his case, the biggest of his career, had ended without resolution. He'd spent years working toward what he thought was justice for Jill Dando, only to see that conviction overturned and the real killer still unknown. With Barry George eliminated as a suspect, Investigators had to look again at all those theories they'd explored in the early days of the investigation. The problem was that none of them had ever been particularly convincing, and time hadn't made them any stronger. But they were all police had left, so they went back through the files, re-examined old leads, tried to see if anything new jumped out with fresh eyes. The professional hit theory remained the most compelling explanation for many people familiar with the case. The execution-style killing, the single shot to the head, the clean escape, the complete absence of evidence, it all suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Not a crime of passion, not a burglary gone wrong, not a random attack. This was planned, professional, efficient. But if it was a professional hit, who ordered it and why? The Serbian connection got renewed attention after Barry George's acquittal. In April 1999, NATO was still bombing Serbia over Kosovo, and tensions were high. Some investigators felt this angle had never been fully explored, that perhaps international dimensions of the case had been set aside too quickly when Barry George became the focus. They looked again at whether Serbian intelligence or criminal organizations might have targeted Jill as retaliation for BBC coverage of the conflict. The theory went like this. Serbian leaders were furious about how Western media was portraying the Kosovo War. They saw journalists as complicit in building public support for NATO intervention. Killing a high-profile BBC presenter would send a message. We can reach you anywhere, even in your own capital. Even your most beloved media figures aren't safe. It would be a demonstration of capability, a warning to back off, a way of striking back when they couldn't effectively fight NATO militarily. There was some circumstantial support for this theory. A Swedish journalist named Katarina Larsson reported that she'd been approached by someone with Serbian connections shortly before Jill's murder, someone who'd made vague threats about journalists paying a price for their coverage. After Jill was killed, Larsson contacted British police to share this information, but it's unclear how seriously they pursued it. Other reports suggested that Serbian hit squads were operating in Western Europe during this period, targeting various enemies of the Milosevic regime. But the problems with the Serbian theory were significant. First, Jill wasn't really a target that made sense. She wasn't a war correspondent or investigative journalist exposing Serbian atrocities. She was a news reader and entertainment presenter who happened to work for the BBC. If you were going to target a British journalist over Kosovo coverage, why pick someone so peripheral to that coverage? Second, Serbian intelligence services, while certainly capable of violence, typically targeted specific enemies, dissidents, defectors, political opponents. Killing a random British television presenter would be unusual for them. And third, despite years of investigation, no concrete evidence ever emerged linking Serbian operatives to the murder. Still, the theory persisted, partly because the alternative explanations were even less satisfying. If it wasn't a professional hit ordered by foreign intelligence, then what was it? The stalker theory also got re-examined after Barry George's acquittal. Police went back through all the fan mail Jill had received over the years, looking for anyone whose obsession might have escalated to violence. They re-interviewed people who'd shown inappropriate interest in her, checked to see if anyone had a history they'd missed the first time around. What they found was what they'd found before. Several individuals who'd been overly interested in Jill, who'd written strange letters or shown up at BBC events hoping to meet her, but nothing that clearly connected anyone to her murder. Obsessive fans are unfortunately common for anyone in the public eye, but most of them never cross the line into actual violence. And the ones who do usually don't operate with the kind of professional precision that killed Jill Dando. Stalkers who kill their obsessions tend to do it messily, emotionally, in ways that reflect their psychological disturbance. This killing was controlled, efficient, almost cold in its execution. Some investigators wondered if the answer might lie in cases Crime Watch had covered, that perhaps someone connected to a crime featured on the show had blamed Jill personally and decided to take revenge. They went back through years of episodes, cross-referencing with criminals who'd been caught, imprisoned, and released. They looked at cases where convictions had been overturned, where someone might feel they'd been wrongly accused based on Crime Watch publicity. They investigated whether anyone connected to a case had made threats against Jill or the show. Again, they found a few individuals worth looking at. People who'd expressed anger about how their case had been presented, people who felt the show had ruined their lives even if they'd ultimately been acquitted. But none of these leads went anywhere solid. Most of the people involved had moved on with their lives. Most had alibis for April 26, 1999. Most seemed genuinely shocked that anyone would think they were capable of murder. One theory that emerged more prominently after Barry George's acquittal involved the possibility that Jill had been killed by mistake, that the real target was someone else who lived on or near Gowan Avenue. This would explain why the motive remained so unclear. If Jill wasn't the intended victim, then looking into her life for reasons why someone would want her dead was pointless. Detectives examined whether anyone else on the street might have been involved in something that could make them a target for assassination. They looked at financial records, business dealings, personal relationships. They found nothing remarkable. Gowan Avenue was full of ordinary middle-class professionals living quiet lives. Nobody seemed like an obvious target for a professional hit. Another angle suggested that maybe the killer had been sent to the right street but got the wrong house number, that they'd been given incomplete or inaccurate information and killed the wrong person. This would make the murder even more tragic. Jill died because someone couldn't get an address right. But again, no evidence supported this theory. It was speculation built on the foundation of having no better explanation. As the years went by, the investigation remained technically open but essentially dormant. Occasionally something would happen that would bring renewed media attention to the case. A newspaper would run a big feature on the anniversary of Jill's death, rehashing all the old theories and lamenting that justice had never been served. A documentary would be produced, interviewing everyone involved, presenting the evidence, asking viewers if they knew anything. Television shows about unsolved mysteries would include Jill's case, keeping it in the public consciousness. In 2012, on the BBC's Crime Watch program, the very show Jill had once hosted, they did a special segment on her murder, appealing again for anyone with information to come forward. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, who'd taken over Operation Oxborough by then, appeared on camera to say that police still believed the case was solvable, that someone out there knew who killed Jill Dando, and that it wasn't too late to come forward. The appeal generated some new tips, but none led anywhere productive. Every few years, a journalist or researcher would claim to have new evidence or a new theory. Someone would publish a book examining the case from a fresh angle. Podcasts would dedicate episodes to discussing what might have happened on Gowan Avenue that morning. The case became part of true crime culture, endlessly analyzed and debated by amateur detectives convinced they could solve what professional investigators couldn't. Some of these alternative theories got pretty wild. One suggested that Jill had been killed by British intelligence services because she'd stumbled onto something sensitive involving government corruption or security matters. Another claimed she'd been having an affair with someone dangerous who decided to eliminate her. There were theories involving international arms dealers, Russian oligarchs, Middle Eastern terrorist groups. None of them had any real evidence supporting them, but in the absence of a clear answer, speculation filled the vacuum. For Jill's family, the lack of resolution was torture. Her fiancé, Alan Fentiman, struggled to move on with his life. How do you process grief when there's no closure, when the person who killed your partner remains unknown and unpunished? Her brother, Jill Dando, became a spokesperson for the family, occasionally giving interviews where he'd express frustration with the investigation but also gratitude for the police who'd worked so hard on the case. He maintained hope that someday somehow the truth would emerge. The wider impact of Jill's unsolved murder extended beyond her immediate circle. It shook public confidence in the idea that high-profile crimes always get solved. It revealed how even with enormous resources, media attention, and public pressure, some cases remain stubbornly unsolvable. It showed that in modern Britain, someone could kill a beloved celebrity in broad daylight in a residential neighborhood and simply vanish. For the Metropolitan Police, the case represented a significant failure. They'd thrown everything at it: thousands of hours of detective work, millions of pounds in resources, cooperation with international law enforcement agencies. They'd arrested and prosecuted someone who turned out to be the wrong person. They'd pursued countless leads that went nowhere. And after all that effort, after all that time, they were no closer to knowing who killed Jill Dando than they'd been on April 26, 1999. Some retired detectives who'd worked on the case would later admit, off the record, that they believed it would never be solved. Too much time had passed. The killer had been too careful, too professional. Whatever physical evidence might have existed had long since been lost or destroyed. Witnesses who might have seen something useful had forgotten details or moved away or died. The case had gone cold in the truest sense of the term. In 2019, on the 20th anniversary of Jill's murder, the BBC produced a major documentary examining the case. They interviewed investigators, journalists, criminologists, people who'd known Jill. They presented all the evidence, walked through all the theories, and ultimately concluded what everyone already knew. Nobody knows who killed Jill Dando or why. The documentary ended with the same appeal that had been made countless times before. If you know anything, please come forward. By 2025, more than 25 years after the murder, Operation Oxborough remains technically open but attracts minimal active investigation. The Metropolitan Police will tell you they haven't given up, that they continue to assess any new information that comes in, that advances in forensic technology might eventually provide a breakthrough. But realistically, everyone knows that unless someone who knows what happened decides to talk, this case isn't getting solved. The most likely scenario is that whoever killed Jill Dando has either died themselves or will take the secret to their grave. If it was a professional hit, the person who pulled the trigger was probably a hired gun who killed for money and has no personal connection to Jill or Britain. They might be living in another country now, might have committed other murders before and since, might have no reason to ever confess. The person who ordered the hit, if there was one, similarly has every incentive to stay silent forever. If it wasn't a professional hit, if it was someone local with a personal motive, then they've managed to maintain their silence for over 2 decades despite living with the knowledge that they murdered one of Britain's most beloved television personalities. That takes a particular kind of coldness, a particular ability to compartmentalize, to live normally while carrying that secret. What makes Jill Dando's murder so haunting isn't just that it's unsolved. Plenty of murders remain unsolved. It's the combination of factors: the victim's fame and the public's affection for her, the brazen nature of the attack in broad daylight, the professional execution, the complete absence of evidence, the failed prosecution, and the enduring mystery of motive. All of it combines to create a case that fascinates and frustrates in equal measure. Somewhere, someone knows what happened on Gowan Avenue on April 26, 1999. Someone knows who walked up behind Jill Dando as she unlocked her door, who pressed a gun to her head, who pulled the trigger and walked away. That person has kept that secret for more than 25 years. They've watched the media coverage, the investigations, the theories. They've seen Barry George arrested, tried, convicted, and acquitted. They've watched as the case grew cold and the investigation wound down. And they've said nothing. That silence is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Because whoever killed Jill Dando didn't just take her life. They robbed her family of closure, robbed the public of justice, and left a wound in Britain's collective consciousness that's never really healed. The case remains open, technically speaking, but in practical terms, it belongs now to history, an enduring mystery that reminds us how fragile life is and how imperfect our systems of justice can be. 26 years have passed since Jill Dando was murdered on her doorstep. An entire generation has grown up who never saw her on television, who don't remember the shock that rippled through Britain when the news broke. For them, she's a historical figure, a name attached to one of the country's most famous unsolved murders. But for those who knew her, who watched her every week, who felt that personal connection that television creates between presenter and audience, the loss remains fresh in ways that time hasn't diminished. What's remarkable about Jill's murder isn't just that it happened or that it remains unsolved. It's what the case reveals about the limitations of even the most well-resourced criminal investigations, about how someone can commit a brazen act of violence and simply disappear, about how justice sometimes remains permanently out of reach no matter how badly we want it. The Metropolitan Police conducted one of the largest murder investigations in British history. At its peak, Operation Oxborough involved dozens of detectives working full-time on nothing but this case. They took over 2,500 witness statements. They followed up on more than 2,000 separate lines of inquiry. They examined the lives of over 1,000 potential suspects. They coordinated with intelligence services both domestic and international. They spent millions of pounds. They devoted thousands of hours. And despite all that effort, all that dedication, all those resources, they came up empty. Well, not quite empty. They arrested Barry George, prosecuted him, convinced a jury to convict him. For 8 years, everyone believed the case was solved. The Metropolitan Police held press conferences celebrating their success. Jill's family tried to find peace knowing her killer was behind bars. The public moved on, satisfied that justice had been served. But it had all been built on a foundation of questionable forensic evidence and circumstantial connections that ultimately couldn't bear the weight of scrutiny. The Barry George saga is its own cautionary tale about what happens when the pressure to solve a case overwhelms the obligation to solve it correctly. Police were under enormous pressure from the media, from the public, from politicians, from Jill's family. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone wanted someone held accountable. And when Barry George emerged as a suspect, local, odd, with a disturbing history and no alibi, it must have been tempting to believe they'd found their man. He fit the profile of someone who could have done it, even if the evidence that he actually did was thin. The wrongful conviction, because that's what it was, even if it was later overturned, represents a failure not just of this investigation but of the justice system more broadly. Juries are instructed to convict only when the evidence proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt. In Barry George's case, that standard clearly wasn't met. A single particle of firearms discharge residue, ambiguous CCTV footage, and the fact that he was a strange man who lived nearby, that shouldn't have been enough. But it was because people wanted it to be, because the alternative was accepting that Jill's killer might never be caught. Looking back at the various theories about who killed Jill and why, what's striking is how none of them really hold up under scrutiny. The professional hit theory makes sense in terms of how the murder was executed, but struggles to explain why anyone would want Jill dead. She wasn't an investigative journalist exposing dangerous criminals. She wasn't involved in politics or espionage. She was a television presenter who made travel shows and read the news. The Serbian connection remains the most plausible version of the professional hit theory, but even that requires believing that foreign intelligence services would target someone so peripheral to actual war coverage. The stalker theory has more emotional resonance. The idea of an obsessed fan whose fantasy turned violent, but doesn't match the clinical precision of how she was killed. Stalkers who murder their obsessions usually do so in ways that are personal, messy, driven by psychological breakdown. They don't typically execute single-shot assassinations and disappear cleanly. The Crime Watch revenge theory assumes someone blamed Jill personally for their prosecution or conviction, but she was just the presenter. She didn't investigate crimes or decide which cases got featured. Targeting her for revenge would be like shooting the news anchor because you didn't like a story they read off a teleprompter. The mistaken identity theory, that someone meant to kill a different person on Gowan Avenue, is perhaps the most tragic possibility because it would mean Jill died essentially by accident. But there's no evidence anyone else on that street was involved in anything that would make them a target for assassination. What you're left with is a case where none of the explanations quite work, where every theory has significant problems, where the truth remains stubbornly elusive. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the reason this case remains unsolved isn't that police were incompetent or didn't work hard enough. Maybe it's simply that the killer was careful, professional, and lucky. They didn't leave evidence. They weren't seen clearly by witnesses. They had no obvious connection to Jill that would have led investigators to them. They executed their plan and disappeared, and sometimes that's all it takes. The advances in forensic technology over the past 25 years, DNA analysis, digital surveillance, cell phone tracking, all the tools that have helped solve cold cases, don't help much when the original crime scene yielded so little evidence. There's no DNA to retest because none was found. There's no digital trail to follow because this happened in 1999 when phone tracking and CCTV coverage were far less comprehensive than today. The evidence that exists is the same evidence that existed on day one, and it hasn't gotten any more revealing with time. For Jill's family, the lack of closure has been a burden they've carried for more than 2 decades. Alan Fentiman, the man who should have married Jill in September 1999, had to rebuild his life around a loss that never made sense and never found resolution. Her brother Nigel became the family spokesperson, giving occasional interviews where he'd express gratitude for the continued police work while clearly struggling with the reality that his sister's killer would likely never be caught. Other family members and friends chose to grieve more privately, but the unresolved nature of the case made that grief harder to process. There's a particular cruelty in unsolved murders that goes beyond the immediate loss. When someone dies naturally or in an accident, you grieve and eventually find ways to move forward. When someone is murdered but the killer is caught and punished, there's at least the consolation that justice was served, that society held someone accountable. But when a murder remains unsolved, the wound never fully closes. There's no closure, no sense that the wrong has been addressed, no way to feel that your loved one's death mattered in any meaningful way beyond the immediate grief. For the wider public, Jill Dando's murder represented a crack in the comfortable assumptions many people held about safety and justice. If someone as famous, as beloved, as visible as Jill Dando could be executed in broad daylight in a nice London neighborhood and the killer could just vanish, then what did that say about everyone else's safety? If the Metropolitan Police couldn't solve this case despite throwing everything at it, what chance did ordinary crime victims have of getting justice? The case also revealed the limitations of media attention in solving crimes. Usually, high-profile cases get solved precisely because they're high-profile. More resources, more tips from the public, more pressure on investigators to produce results. But in this case, all that attention didn't help. If anything, it might have hindered the investigation by creating pressure to make an arrest before the evidence really supported one, leading to the Barry George prosecution. Crime writers, journalists, and amateur investigators have been fascinated by this case for decades, and it's not hard to understand why. It has all the elements of a compelling mystery: a beloved victim, a brazen crime, professional execution, multiple theories, a wrongful conviction, and an enduring lack of resolution. It's the kind of case that makes people want to dig deeper, to find the clue everyone else missed, to be the one who finally cracks it. Dozens of books, documentaries, podcasts, and articles have examined every angle of the investigation. Some have proposed new theories. Others have simply rehashed the existing evidence. None have solved the case. What often gets lost in all the theorizing and investigation and media coverage is Jill herself. Not as a murder victim, but as a person who lived a full life before that Monday morning in April 1999. She grew up in Somerset, worked her way up through local media to national prominence, built a career based on talent and hard work, made friends, had relationships, planned a future. She was more than just the woman from Crime Watch who got murdered. She was a skilled broadcaster, a dedicated professional, someone her colleagues respected and audiences trusted. Nick Ross, her Crime Watch co-host, has spoken over the years about what it was like working with Jill, about her professionalism and warmth, about how much she cared about the victims whose cases they featured on the show. She took the work seriously, understood that behind every crime reconstruction was a real family desperate for answers. The irony that she would become one of those victims, that her own family would be the ones desperate for answers, that her case would end up as an unsolved mystery far more famous than most of the crimes Crime Watch ever covered, it's almost unbearably tragic. Her colleagues at the BBC remember her not just for how she died but for how she lived. She was someone who lit up a room, who made the work environment better, who balanced the serious news coverage with genuine humor and humanity. She was planning a wedding, thinking about starting a family, looking forward to the future. She had no idea that morning when she stopped at her Fulham house that she had less than an hour left to live. That's what murder takes, not just a life but all the unlived years that should have followed. Jill was 37 when she died. She could have had another 50 years. She could have had children, grandchildren. She could have continued her broadcasting career, mentored younger journalists, perhaps moved into producing or directing. She could have grown old with Alan, traveled the world on actual vacations instead of filming locations, lived the peaceful life she'd earned through years of hard work. All of that was stolen from her in the second it took for someone to pull a trigger. The investigation into her murder consumed enormous resources over the years, but it's worth asking whether it was all worth it. On one hand, you could argue that no expense should be spared in trying to solve the murder of someone as prominent as Jill Dando, that the investigation sent an important message about how seriously Britain takes such crimes. On the other hand, the resources devoted to this one case could have been distributed across dozens of other unsolved murders where families also deserve justice. Is one life worth more than another? Should investigations be prioritized based on how famous the victim was? These aren't easy questions and they don't have comfortable answers. The reality is that high-profile cases do get more attention, more resources, more public interest. That's always been true and probably always will be. But it's worth acknowledging the inequity of it, recognizing that for every unsolved murder that becomes a national obsession, there are hundreds of others that get minimal investigation and even less media coverage. What Jill Dando's case ultimately demonstrates is how imperfect our justice system is, how many crimes go unsolved despite our best efforts, how sometimes there simply aren't answers no matter how desperately we want them. It's an uncomfortable truth that challenges our desire to believe that good triumphs over evil, that justice always prevails, that the guilty always get caught. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they get away with it. Sometimes the case remains in a filing cabinet somewhere, technically open but practically dormant, while the person responsible lives their life freely. There are people who believe that advances in technology will eventually solve this case. Maybe some piece of evidence currently sitting in storage will be re-examined with new forensic techniques and yield results it couldn't yield before. Maybe someone who knows something will finally decide to talk, motivated by guilt or circumstance or just the passage of time. Maybe some random connection will emerge that ties everything together in a way no one saw before. But realistically, the most likely scenario is that the murder of Jill Dando will remain unsolved forever. The killer, whether a professional assassin, a deranged stalker, a political operative, or someone else entirely, has maintained their silence for more than a quarter century. If they haven't talked by now, they probably never will. The evidence that doesn't exist won't magically appear. The witnesses who didn't see anything useful won't suddenly remember crucial details. The case will remain in the files, occasionally reviewed, never closed, never solved. For those who remember Jill, who watched her on television, who felt that parasocial connection that comes from inviting someone into your living room week after week, her death remains a wound that hasn't healed. Every year on April 26th, people remember. Flowers still appear at the site where she was killed, though fewer now than in earlier years. Her name still comes up in discussions about unsolved British murders. She's still remembered, still mourned, still missed. But memory fades. The generation that knew Jill from television is getting older. Younger people know her only as that presenter who got murdered, if they know her at all. Eventually, even famous unsolved cases fade from collective consciousness, becoming historical footnotes rather than living tragedies. That's perhaps the saddest part of cases like this. Not just that justice was never served, but that even the memory of the victim eventually fades. What remains is the case itself, a mystery that has fascinated and frustrated investigators, journalists, and amateur detectives for decades. It stands as a reminder that some questions don't have answers, that some crimes don't get solved, that sometimes the bad guys do get away with it. It's not the ending anyone wanted for Jill Dando's story, but it's the ending we got, and after 26 years, it's probably the ending we're stuck with. Somewhere, possibly, someone knows what really happened on Gowan Avenue that Monday morning in April 1999. They know who pulled the trigger, why Jill was targeted, how the killer escaped. They've kept that secret for more than a quarter century, through investigations and trials and media coverage and public appeals. The question is whether they'll take that secret to their grave, or whether someday somehow the truth will finally emerge. Until then, the murder of Jill Dando remains one of Britain's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a case that had everything except the one thing that mattered most, an answer. If this take into the Jill Dando case has been compelling, informative, or thought-provoking, viewers are encouraged to show their support. Leaving a like on the video helps it reach others who might be interested in this unsolved mystery. Subscribing to the channel ensures access to future investigations into other fascinating true crime cases and unsolved mysteries that deserve attention. The comments section below is open for discussion. What theory seems most plausible? What details stand out? What questions remain unanswered? The conversation continues with every viewer who shares their perspective. Thank you for watching. The story of Jill Dando may not have a conclusion, but it remains one that needs to be told and remembered.